People were free to come here looking for a fortune, but the, we'll say, application of the law might have been a bit lax. There was a sense of an open port where anything could happen.
According to accounts of the time, there were robberies and stabbings every day. There was a tiny police force, but the policemen were often the first to be murdered.
When Raffles returns in 1822, he's just aghast. It hasn't quite got the feel of this English colonial trade port that he imagined. And he basically fires Farquhar.
I can't believe what you've done! What kind of place are you running here? Slaves, cockfighting, opium dens?
Raffles blamed Farquhar for allowing the settlement to lose its way.
I don't care how they live. We have a responsibility.
He expected higher standards for his little child.
And you're not setting a very good example.
Raffles perceived it as being chaotic. He wants it to create ideas of science and the arts and literature that were being promoted by the Enlightenment in the late 18th century.
The Enlightenment in Europe was an age of reason, order, and progress. And Raffles hoped to bring these lofty ideals to Singapore. While the town was still in its infancy, he drew up an elaborate blueprint for its future, laying out a modern grid structure of roads, dividing up the population into different ethnic areas. Everything was designed to be as rational and efficient as possible.
He left specific instructions for the style of architecture. The famous Singapore 5-foot way, which was a sort of continuous arcade on either side of the street, which would protect you from the sun and also from the rain. And the facades of the building were to have a uniform appearance. So he thought about all these little details.
In Raffles' vision, the river would be the central artery of the town, along which trade could flow. He created a wharf, Boat Quay, to be a focal point for mercantile establishments. Today, the Singapore River is quiet, to be enjoyed by pleasure boats. But throughout the 19th century, cargo from around the world traveled along the river and filled the warehouses of Boat Quay, just as Raffles had predicted.
The smell, the sounds, the atmosphere, the environment would have been very different. Moored alongside the banks would have been tongkangs, sampans, lightermen, and they would have blocked up this entire river with barely enough room for any big craft to move in. And people would be moving sacks of rice, of goods from the warehouses, from the go-downs, and that would have been a scene that you would have seen in the late 19th century, early 20th century Singapore. This was the place where commerce started in Singapore. This was the cradle of commerce.
Today, the warehouses of Boat Quay have been closed down and relocated to the modern port. But Raffles' other creation is very much alive. Behind the quayside, he designated a swampy, uninhabited area to become the commercial center of town. The skyscrapers of the modern business district sit on exactly the same spot today. Raffles believed that free trade had a magical quality that could transform Singapore, and this skyline is testament to that belief. The central square in the business district still has the same shape and dimensions as when it was first designed. Only now, it is known as Raffles Place, in honor of its founder.
Shortly before he left Singapore for the last time, he wrote to a correspondent in England, and he said something like, I've had to mold everything from first to last, to introduce a system of energy, purity, and encouragement that will last for a century or two. That's Raffles thinking 200 years ahead.
In June 1823, Raffles returned to England, suffering from a suspected brain tumor. He had spent just 9 months in total in Singapore. During that time, he turned it from an obscure, irrelevant island into a bustling port and committed it to a future of free trade. But was free trade really as magical as Raffles believed? Could it alone conjure up the city of his dreams? Singapore is a city built for the purpose of free trade. The idea that anyone can buy and sell whatever they like without interference from government has been at the cornerstone of Singapore's success since it was first introduced in the 19th century. By the 1850s, the island had already enjoyed 3 decades of free-flowing trade. There was an international community of wealthy traders and merchants. Few were wealthier than Hu Ah-kay, better known as Whampoa. He could buy and sell almost anything that was needed on the island, and was extremely popular. The British called him the best Chinaman who ever lived.
The kind of people who were getting really rich were the local traders. There were Chinese and there were Arabs and there were Indians who were operating at what in today's terms you would call small and medium enterprises who could build up. They were not capital intensive anyway. It was quite easy for them to make money. They're not paying taxes. You're not charging them anything for the use of the services made available to them. Of course they made money. For the company, it's quite a different matter.
The East India Company, which ran Singapore, was in financial trouble. Its lucrative Chinese tea trade had collapsed as people in Britain preferred Indian tea, which could be drunk with milk. The company was still obliged to govern the settlement, but it did so very reluctantly.
By the 1850s, the company saw Singapore as a complete burden. It wasn't bringing any profit or interest to the company whatsoever. The private merchants were making a great deal of money, but none of this is getting into the government coffers. There is no money to pay for a good police force, for instance. There's no money to pay for port improvements, but the community wants all of these. They want all of them, but there's no money to pay for them.
Ironically, free trade, which had made Singapore wealthy, generated very little revenue for the running of the island. Since Raffles' time, the flow of goods had never been taxed. The policy had become an article of faith among Singapore's merchants and traders.
There was no import taxes. There was no income tax. There was no company tax. And we human beings had not developed at that point of time the GST, the value added tax. Then where do you get the money to finance your state expenditure?
The company came up with an unusual plan to raise revenue by encouraging vice. The right to supply opium was licensed and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Whoever won the license was then free to sell as much of the drug as they liked, without any restrictions. But the more opium they sold, the more they needed to keep selling, because the company kept pushing up the cost of the license. It was a vicious circle.